Hello again, Pastor Mike here, and on the last video, I told you a bit about the journey that the elders have been on at Foothills Fellowship for the last 5 or so years that really leads up to today, where I'm going to reveal to you our new vision, our new mission, and our new strategy for our church moving forward. Using the analogy that I gave you last time, if you remember, from Canoeing the Mountains, a book that we as elders read, and I explained some of that. The journey for us began years ago, back when we were happily canoeing down the waterway, and we came to the end of the waterway and we smacked right into the Rocky Mountains. And in that analogy, as I told you last time, the river being the way that we had done church for actually decades, and the canoe representing the vehicles that we use, the different ways of ministry that we were using that worked on the river, and the Rocky Mountains that we ended up running into being the seismic shift that has taken place in our culture from a Christian culture to a post-Christian culture that we now find ourselves in here in America. As I stated last week, this book helped us in the middle of kind of a survival mode because of COVID. As we began to make plans to move forward, we had some time to just press into asking good questions and just evaluating everything. But we found ourselves stuck. The waterway that we had been on for decades was now dried up. Our canoe, the different ways in which we were doing ministry really those weren't working as well anymore. And it makes sense because the waterway had dried up, so a canoe doesn't really work anymore. And the mountains ahead of us were really daunting, and we found ourselves just saying, we're not sure as a church how to move forward. But as we discussed the book, like I said last time on the last video, it helped us to realize that if we needed to move ahead, if we wanted to move ahead, we needed to, number one, revisit our goal. Where are we headed? The Lewis and Clark analogy of canoeing the mountains was they needed to find a waterway to the Pacific. Well, the waterway ran out, but the goal was still getting to the Pacific Ocean. So we needed to ask, well, what is our Pacific Ocean? Does that need to shift at all? What is our goal? We needed to then be willing to leave our canoes behind and find maybe new ways for moving forward now that we were on dry land, moving into uncharted territories of the mountains. And like Lewis and Clark, we needed guides. They found people and befriended people along the way in the mountains that helped them to make their way through the mountains and eventually to the Pacific Ocean. And so we recognize that there may be outside organizations, other churches that we needed to look to for help. And this has led us to, in many ways, reimagine and refashion our vision, our mission, and our strategy. Our vision would be what we want our church to become, our ultimate goal as a church. Our mission then is what we need to do to realize our vision. In other words, for Lewis and Clark, how are we now going to get to the Pacific now that the waterways have run out, and we, being expert canoemen, we need to figure out another way. So how do we do it? And then the strategy is the specifics on how to move forward. So what I want to do today is share with you where we've landed. Now understand, this was not something that the elders did alone. Please don't envision us locking ourselves in a room and coming up with all of this in a vacuum. Our wives have been involved. This has been a process of a couple of years. And many of you at Foothills have actually been involved as well. Over the last few years, we have experimented with many different strategies, and many of you have helped us to decide whether or not these strategies work or don't work. And now it's my job on this video to lay out what all of this is as clearly and as simply as possible. So let's start with our vision statement. First, I want to take a look at our current vision statement. This is what we say right now that we desire our church to become. a worshiping community of God's people whose lives are shaped by the life, death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, and who participate in the mission of God's kingdom by proclaiming the good news locally, nationally, and globally. Now, that's our current vision statement. And we as elders agree that this is a very good vision statement. It is standing the test of time. I've always said about this vision statement that every church should strive to become this. This is what every church should be doing, and I think that's the problem. Every local expression of the church is unique and different. And so this mission statement that we've been working under is too general. It's too big. It's not specific to who we are as Foothills Fellowship. It doesn't take into consideration our DNA, our uniqueness, our personality, our distinctives. It would be like setting the exact same goal for all of your children without considering who they are individually or how God has wired each one of them, how God has shaped their personalities, how they are unique, how they are distinct from one another. And so while we like this current vision, we spent a lot of time thinking and talking and praying about who we are as a church. How has God wired us collectively as an individual local expression of the church? What's our DNA and our distinctives? And with all of that in mind, here is our vision for moving forward. And you'll find that it's not overly different, and I'll show you how. The wording is different, but it's not overly different from our current one, but I think it's a little more pinpoint. With all that in mind, here is our vision moving forward. What we want Foothills Fellowship to become, our goal. What is our Pacific Ocean? Here it is: a church flourishing with unified and healthy Jesus-shaped communities of fully equipped disciples who are on mission together, making new disciples and transforming culture. Let's say that again, because it takes a while for things to sink in. A church flourishing with unified and healthy Jesus-shaped communities of fully equipped disciples who are on mission together, making new disciples and transforming culture. Now, over the last few years, we have sensed, and you've picked up on this, that God has brought disciple making into a clear focus for Foothills Fellowship, being a church of healthy and unified disciples who together seek to make disciples. It's really Matthew 28, 19, and 20, the Great Commission. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely I am with you always to the very end of the age. It's also the essence of Jesus' final words in Acts chapter 1, verse 8, before the ascension. He says, you will receive power. Now he's talking to a small band of followers, the only band of followers that he had at that time. You will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes on you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth. And so as elders, we see, maybe clearer now than ever before, that the church is to function as a local expression of disciples who grow in their faith together, who love each other, who stick together, and who together go on mission to make disciples of Jesus who aren't. And as the local church does this, the culture then in which we live is transformed, one disciple of Jesus at a time. And church, this is how the church makes a difference in the world. It's when disciples together are equipped and encouraged and called and then go out together, maybe in groups of two, maybe in bigger groups than that, but together they go out into the community seeking to invite others to join them in following Jesus. Now, let me talk a minute about the phrase Jesus-shaped communities, because our vision statement says that we want to be a church flourishing with unified and healthy Jesus-shaped communities. Now, As you know, we've used this term, Jesus shaped, a lot over the past few years. Simply, it means that we want to be people who together imitate the three spheres or the three dimensions that Jesus spent his time in. Up with the Father, in with one another, and out together to make disciples. We want to see a church full of people who are striving to do those three things together, in those three spheres together. Up, worshiping, learning about God, studying his word together, in with one another. We recognize that the Christian life is not meant to be lived alone. And so we want to be in community with one another. And then as a community, we want to see ways in which we can go out together to make disciples. This is what we desire to do as a church, and this is what we want to see our church consist of. Smaller groups of people who imitate Jesus together. Now, this can take on lots of forms. But living the Jesus-shaped life together is what the elders desire our church to become, because it includes us becoming, now catch this, a worshiping community of God's people whose lives are shaped by the life, death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, who participate in the mission of God's kingdom by proclaiming the good news locally, and some may sense a call to do it nationally and globally. So it's like another way of getting at that more general vision statement that we once had. We want that, what we will now call old vision statement, to stand behind our new vision statement as a shadow, because we see that this is how we can do this. It's just being said in more of a laser-focused way, and it more specifically states what we are hoping and striving to become, and that is unified disciples on mission to make other disciples. And then this leads us now then to our mission. It's just a pithy statement. Could be t-shirtable. I'm not suggesting we make t-shirts, but it's that kind of a statement that clearly communicates what we must do to see this vision that I just laid out for us become a reality. And so our new mission then is equipping disciples of Jesus to make disciples who make disciples. That is what we must do in order to realize the vision that we want to become. We have to equip, as a church, we have to equip disciples of Jesus to make disciples who make disciples. This is what we as a church must do in order to become a church that is flourishing with unified and healthy Jesus-shaped communities of fully equipped disciples who are on mission together, making new disciples and transforming culture. We must be a church that is equipping disciples of Jesus to make disciples who make disciples. Now that makes sense, to me at least. Should make sense to you if we want to become a place that is flourishing with communities of disciple makers who make disciples, and we see our culture around us transformed. Then we have to equip people to make disciples who make disciples, right? That makes sense, and it sounds good, but I'm sure the question you have now is, well, how do we do that? Because many churches have some mention of disciple making in their vision or mission statement, but my experience with churches, and even with our own church, is that few are actually pulling it off. Few churches are actually really equipping their disciples to make disciples. As I've said many times before, what churches mostly do is focus on the up and the in, worshiping God and being together, and that out component is missing. Even though we talk about it and we want that to happen, what we have to realize is it doesn't just happen by spending time up with the Father and in with one another. There has to be some equipping, some empowering, some calling to that out component. And what we see then also is that because we're not going out, even fewer churches are seeing disciples who then actually make disciples. The disciple-making process is actually often cut off by the church because of the upward and the inward focus without the out focus. And so this is where our strategy piece comes in. The nuts and bolts, the how of equipping disciples of Jesus to make disciples who make disciples. Now, before I walk you through the strategy, let me say something up front about the strategy. Let me say two things actually about it. First of all, for those who are a part of Foothills right now, this will not be overly new to you. You've already done some of this. You're doing it because we've been trying different things over the last couple of years, trying to see what will work and what doesn't work in our context. Some things that we've tried haven't worked, and so we've kind of pushed those aside. And some things that we've tried have worked, and so we want to press into those things. It's important when you think about casting vision and new mission and strategy to also consider reality. What will work or what is working in our specific context, and what won't work and what isn't working. And so we spent the last couple of years trying to figure that out. You can have all the vision in the world, you can have a great mission statement, but it has to collide with the reality of your context. And that's what we've seen over the last couple of years. Second thing I want to mention is that this is the strategy we will pursue for now. We believe that this is the best way for us to take the next step. Or to use the canoeing the mountains analogy again, we see that this is the best way for us to begin the journey into the uncharted mountains of doing church and being church in a post-Christian culture. After coming in our canoes, we've been doing the canoes, right? But we've come to the end of the waterway. So we see this as the next step to begin this journey. This strategy is how we plan to begin our journey into the uncharted territory. And we'll see how long these vehicles work. We feel like they will work, and they actually have been working for now. And so we'll see how long and how far they'll take us. But the thing about uncharted territory is, in order to make it through, or in the case of the mountain analogy, in order to make it up and then over, we have to be willing to adapt as things change. For instance, as we get higher in the mountains, we may need some vehicles because it's snowy. We need snow vehicles. We need to change some things because the higher we get, the climate changes. And so we need to be thinking that through all of the time. What worked at lower elevations, which is where we are now, we're just beginning this journey, may not work up higher. So we always need to work to understand what's going on around us. How has the weather changed around us? And we need to be willing to adapt. And so one of the things that I want to call our people to is I want to call us to be willing to make changes. And I know for some of you, gung-ho, let's do it. For others, hey, not so fast. You're calling me to this, and then you're saying that this isn't where we're going to land as a strategy for the next 30 years. I don't know if I can handle that. Well, understand things change around us, and we need to be willing to adapt. It doesn't mean that we throw away one vehicle and just bring up another one. We may have to adapt a vehicle, put snow tires on. I don't know. Analogies eventually run their course. But I hope you understand what I'm saying, that we need to be willing and ready to adapt as we see things changing around us. So with that said, let's take a look at the strategy that we as elders feel is the best for the beginning of our journey. I want to frame this strategy in terms of front doors, the ways that people come into our church and eventually become a part of our vision, our mission, and our strategy. Well, there's got to be a front door. How do people come into that? Right now, and for the last many years, all we have had is really one front door, and that is our Sunday worship service. We might call this the traditional front door. It's one that we've used since beginning of Foothills Fellowship back in 1974. All of us came to be a part of the church, or almost all of us. There might be exceptions. There's always exceptions. But most of us came to be a part of the church by entering this front door. We came on a Sunday. We checked the church out, and we decided whether or not we wanted to come back. Some of you came in after checking several other front doors of other churches. Some of you came into ours one time and said, this is where I want to stay. And others of you came in, you checked us out, and then you went and checked out some other front doors, and then you came back. Now, I want you to know that the front door will remain in our new strategy. This front door, the Sunday worship front door. But because this front door has become less and less enticing to unbelievers, remember, post-Christian culture, it's not people's first nature, it's not the flavor of the culture to go to church on Sunday, then we need to do something a little bit different. And because this front door has even become less interesting to some believers, and we saw this with COVID, people have left the church, the traditional front door of coming to church, and they are not coming back. We need another front door. So our new strategy calls for 2 front doors. So I want to tell you how we're going to open up this second door. First, by showing you how we get there through the first front door, the traditional front door, the Sunday worship service. What we are going to start really doing, and we've been doing this, but we're really going to up the call, is for everyone who comes through our traditional front door and is part of our worship services, our church fellowship that way, we are going to call you to join a huddle. Now, we're not going to force you. We're not going to coerce you. You don't have to join a huddle, but we don't think that we're going to be able to accomplish our mission together without this vehicle right now. And so we're going to call everyone to be a part of a huddle. And some of you are familiar with what a huddle is because you are in one or you've been in one. Some of you may not be. A huddle is a gathering of anywhere from 5 to 8 people, sometimes a little less, sometimes a little more, led by a leader who has already been huddled, who is now knowing how to equip you and help you sense the call from God on who he would have you go and make disciples of. And so in this huddle, we'll go over things like the different tools that we have been learning in building a discipling culture. We'll go over some things related to a book called Family on Mission that helps us to sense to whom God is calling us and how to do it together in community. You study the Word, study a book together, whatever it might be. It's a place for you to grow in your own discipleship, but it's also got this constant push, this constant saying of listening to the Lord, this constant listening to the Lord for where he is calling you. And what we've identified as we have done these huddles over the last couple of years is that people are being called to discipleship, to disciple making in one of 4 areas. The first area is there are some of you that are feeling called or will be called by the Lord to build up the body of Christ, to build up believers, to do disciple making in the community of believers. That is very much needed. And so we want to validate that. Some of you will be called that way to believers. Others of you may be called to people of peace. And this is a biblical term from Luke 9 and Luke 10. And simply what it means is these are people that are unsaved, but they are people that you know. They are people that welcome you as you welcome them. They are people that listen to you when you talk about the Lord and they still want to be your friend. And they are people that serve you as you serve them. We might call them good friends, but they're unsaved. And God may be really laying a burden on you for them. And we want to validate that and we want to encourage that. And we want to help you move in that direction to make disciples of those people in your life. Now, some of you are parents and you've got kids in your house. And we are seeing that a lot of you are thinking about disciple making in your own home with your family, with your children. Some of you are thinking about your grandchildren. Some of you are thinking about your parents or siblings who don't know the Lord. We want to validate that. We believe that there is no other place like a home or like a family for disciple making. And so if that's what you're feeling called to, we want to support you. We want to equip you. And huddles can do that as you seek to make disciples in your home or of your family. And then some of you are already called to a ministry outside of the church or inside the church. And we want to validate that. We want to say that if God is calling you to use your disciple making efforts in helping with youth in the church or children, or with ISI, International Student Ministry, that so many of you are involved in, or Awana in another church where God is using you to make disciples of these younger kids, then we want to encourage that. We want to support you. We want to build you up in that. And so the idea of being in a huddle and why we think this is such an important vehicle is because what happens in a huddle is not only are you growing in community in your walk with the Lord, but what is also happening is there is this constant call to be listening to the Lord and to seek Him in who He would have you to go out and make disciples of and to equip you in that. And so then, as we go out in whatever way God has called us, that then opens the second door. And the second door we might call the relational door. We have the traditional door of Sunday morning, but now we have a relational door that is being opened, and we are inviting people into the ministry of Foothills Fellowship as we go out into our neighborhood or our network. Those are just ways of explaining everybody else. It might be your family, it might be your neighbors, it might be a network of people. But that relational door is the one that has to be opened in order for us to really move toward our vision and our mission in making disciples. Because people that need the Lord aren't coming in through our traditional door very much anymore. And so we need to go out and open another door. And that door is the relational door of our neighbors, our family members, and our network. And so next time I want to show you how this is playing out in the huddles that we currently have and how this could play out. And I think that's where it gets really exciting, is when we start seeing how God is already at work and how we are really anticipating that God will work in helping us become a church of disciple makers who make disciples who make disciples. I think a good way to summarize the way in which we see our strategy of disciple making is to call it a gathered, scattered approach, where we primarily use two vehicles, huddles and the worship gathering. Now, some people might bristle at this concept of gathered, scattered, but I think COVID has helped us see that we can do this. We can gather, but we're also scattered. But the idea behind being scattered is this. When we gather, that's wonderful. And some people use that as a front door, and we want to encourage that. But we recognize that not everybody anymore does. And so when we open that second door, that requires us to be scattered to open that second door. And so this gather, scattered approach is the approach that we're pursuing, using huddles and using our worship gathering as ways to do that. And so I just want to say one more thing before we go. And next time I will play out this a little bit more so you can see what God is doing and what God, we hope, will continue to do in and through the vehicle of huddles, how it opens that second door. But I want to remind you that while the vision and the mission of our church, it might get tweaked here or there, but it should never change. That strategy will change as time goes on. Right now, we see that the best vehicle for us getting out of our canoes and beginning our journey into the uncharted territory of the mountains of the post-Christian culture and being a church in that culture is through huddles. That could change. As we go higher and higher into the mountains, we may need a snowmobile. We may need a four-wheeler. We may need some other vehicle for getting us through. And so know that this is where we see God guiding and leading us right now. It could change, but for the foreseeable future, we just want to call every one of you to join a huddle.